Hello and welcome to the third annual Easton Book Festival, sponsored by Book and Puppet Company of Easton, Pennsylvania. Our session today is about self-editing, primarily for short stories, but these principles apply to novels as well. Our session is called Your Story is Perfect. Don't change a thing. Well, except for, and allow me to introduce myself. My name is Phil Giunta. I'm a local writer here in the Lehigh Valley, and I've been writing professionally for 12 years. Primarily in the genres of speculative fiction, which includes sci fi, fantasy, and paranormal, as well as mystery and general fiction. I'm a member of the Greater Lehigh Valley Writers Group, Pennsylvania Press Club, National Federation of Press Women, and the Horror Writers Association. I currently have three paranormal mystery novels on the market, as well as about 2 dozen short stories across multiple genres. But enough about me. Let's dive into our session and start at the very beginning of your story. It's always advisable to start with a strong opening line and to start as close to the action or in the middle of the action, if possible, what they call in medias res. Starting with a strong opening line hooks the reader into your story right away, and starting as close to the action as possible means your story will be tighter and much more concise. Starting with tedium, such as a character waking up out of bed in the morning, brushing his teeth, straightening his hair, taking a shower, then go making his coffee, then stepping out the door before the action starts, wastes a lot of words and a lot of time, and also bores your reader. Here are some examples of some strong opening lines from some couple of very popular books, popular writers. The first is Philip was a farmer. On Earth, it would be a fearful thing to see a man chasing down the street after the skin from a human face. That's from his novel Night of Light. Very evocative, bizarre. Definitely makes you want to read a little bit further to find out what exactly is going on here. The second example is from The World According to Garp by John Irving. Garp's mother, Jenny Fields, was arrested in Boston in 1942 for wounding a man in a movie theater. And the third example, Practicing What I Preach, is an opening line from my second paranormal mystery novel, By Your Side. Miranda Lorenzen was about to watch her brother die again. So these examples give you opening lines that start close to the action or that are evocative and bizarre or strange or powerful and make you want to read further. Also, again, just to reinforce that and to touch on this idea of the opening line, you want to avoid starting the story with the protagonist's morning routine, as I said earlier. You also want to avoid small talk or trivial dialogue that doesn't move the story forward. For example, hi Harry, how are you? Doing great, Tom. How are you? Great. How are the kids? Well, they're doing great. They're at school today, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of small talk or trivial dialogue, it doesn't move the story forward. Again, wastes word count and it also bores the reader and can throw them right out of the story and make them completely uninterested in reading any further. So beginning with a strong opening line is important and as close to the action as possible. As Elmore Leonard said, try to leave out the parts that readers tend to skip. The second thing I want to cover here is extraneous characters. So something I was guilty of very early in my career, my writing career. I have a tendency to outline my stories before I begin writing them, just to give me a sense of where the story is going, the characters, settings and plot, that kind of thing. And sometimes I would write a few too many characters into my outline. And as I was writing the story, I began to realize that I could consolidate some of the dialogue and action of some of these characters into fewer characters. So whereas I might have five characters, I might be able to consolidate two of them into the actions or dialogue into the other three characters. Um, if you have characters in your story that are not advancing the story, not adding anything to the plot, it may be something you can look at to reduce the number of characters and therefore reduce a little bit of word count and possibly transfer their action or their dialogue to some of the other characters in the story. So, in the end, you want to trim or consolidate the characters where possible to ensure that you have only the number and diversity of characters necessary to tell that story. Active voice versus passive voice. This is something that's catches a lot of writers early on, myself included. A lot of what we're going to go through in this session uh, is based on my own personal experience and the mistakes that I made early on. So, part of the reason why I'm doing this is to hopefully help you avoid those mistakes in your writing as well. Active voice makes the subject do something to something else. Subject takes action upon the object, whereas passive voice permits subjects to have something done to them. Now, oftentimes writers are advised against passive voice, or at least excessive use of it, but there are examples where passive voice is actually the better option. In the first example we have here, we have active versus passive voice. The community college owns this building. Or in passive voice, this building is owned by the community college, which is two words longer. Once again, if you're a short story writer and you're trying to bring your story underneath a word count and you're going line by line and trying to trim and tighten and make your narrative and your prose and your dialogue as concise as possible, this is a perfect example of a line to rewrite so that you can cut two words out of your story. Second example, our soldiers defeated the enemy versus the enemy was defeated by our soldiers. Again, two words longer in the passive voice. If you rewrote that sentence, you would drop two words. Therefore, once again, tightening your story. Not to put too fine a point on the active versus passive voice, but the noun that would be the object in active voice becomes the subject in passive voice. Also, auxiliary verbs are often used to construct verb phrases. Was defeated by and is owned by. Uh, Again, this is making longer sentences, weaker sentences, less evocative prose. However, passive voice does have its place. Let's take this example. The passive voice, Smith was elected president, versus the active voice of the people elected Smith president. Well, wait a minute. The active voice is one word longer there. Well, in your story, it may be given that it's the public or the people who are electing Smith president. So you may not necessarily need to even mention them in your sentence. So in this case, the passive voice prevails. It is one word shorter. Smith was elected president. It gets right to the point. It's shorter, it's concise, and you can go with that. So again, this is an example where passive voice actually makes more sense. Info dumping, the dreaded info dumping. This occurs when a writer includes backstory or other details across multiple paragraphs, multiple pages, whether it's narrative or in some cases, writers try to get away with it in dialogue by having a character wax eloquent or articulate for pages on end, or at least paragraphs on end, providing backstory or providing details trying to convey to another character. And unfortunately, that kind of dense text on a page these days has the detrimental effect of stifling your pacing and irritating the reader, might even throw them out of the story, make them bored very quickly. But a better method for imparting that kind of information would be to spread it out throughout the story, releasing relevant details as appropriate to situations as they arise. For example, if you have a character who has phobias, is afraid of spiders, is afraid of open spaces, is claustrophobic, afraid of tight spaces, that can be revealed during your story if you throw that character into a situation where they'll be exposed to spiders or where they'll be in a tight space, a crawl space. That's when their phobia can be revealed at that point, rather than telling the reader everything about the character up front in the prologue or in a first chapter. Uh, you can certainly feel free as a writer to surprise your readers as you go along in your story and reveal traits and characteristics about your protagonist or your other characters as the story unfolds. Nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, it's probably better. Avoiding excessive descriptions. Similarly, again, you don't want to info dump on your descriptions either. So avoid delving into every minute detail of a setting or a location or of an object, unless that object or location is somehow germane to your story. If it contains a clue, for example, in a murder mystery or a heist story, there may be something about the setting or an object that looks out of place in that setting, and you describe it a bit more than you would normally. You want to do that if you want to have that object or that setting remain in the reader's mind, or at least when they get to the end of the story and you're resolution is revealed, the mystery is solved, that reader will remember that description earlier on in the story. However, if it's a minor detail, if it's something that's unimportant, you don't want to waste too many words describing it. Also, if you're foreshadowing an event later in the story, it's, it's also certainly a good idea to add a little bit more description to something, a character's action, a look on their face, um, something that they do that seems out of character for them, to give that a little bit more description so that will have a payoff later on in your story. Otherwise, try to be as concise as possible and don't delve into too many tedious details about your location. Also, avoiding cliche phrases and descriptions, which often leads to a lot of comedy here, unintended comedy. Cliches are considered weak and lazy writing that tend to cause eye rolls and can disrupt the flow of an otherwise good story. Some cliches make it seem as if your character requires a trip to the emergency room. For example, his eyes followed her around the room, or her eyes darted around the room. If someone's eyes popped out of their head and rolled around the floor, pursuing someone, it certainly would require some medical attention, right? So, how about she couldn't help but stare as the wild bear crossed the veranda, or he fixed his gaze on her. She sauntered toward the pool. Using gaze, using stare, using glare, uh, more active, stronger verbs rather than saying their eyes or their jaw hit the floor, or her face fell, or her heart leapt into his throat. These kind of cliches that, yes, I was guilty of early on in my own writing, but I've seen the light on all of these things through editing and critique sessions, and now as an editor of anthologies myself, I come to see these things as well. And again, I come to you as someone who has made all these mistakes in my own past writing, and have learned to correct them or catch them early on, or completely um, not even have them in my thoughts as I'm writing. Even in a first draft, even as I'm quickly jotting something down, I'll do my best to avoid cliches. Even if I'm just trying to fill in an image in my head, I'll try to avoid using cliches, even in a first draft. Um, so kind of cut it off early. Reducing dialogue tags by using action. This is a great way to produce more evocative prose, concise prose, and really convey more mood. For example, get out of my house, he yelled as he opened the door, versus he threw open the door, get out of my house. The latter sentence conveys a bit more mood through the action of the character. He threw open the door. Clearly, and get out of my house! Exclamation mark. You don't need to have the yelled dialogue tag in there. The fact that he threw open the door shows some anger. Get out of my house with the exclamation mark at the end is enough to know that he is yelling. So, shorter sentences, more clipped sentences, because it is a heightened emotion. And it's always best for me when I'm writing. I know that if I'm writing a scene where emotions are running high, there's conflict, those clipped, shorter sentences, more punchy sentences convey that a lot more than something that's clunky and clumsy and long and drawn out, like he yelled as he opened the door. It's a bit longer, it's a little bit clunky, whereas the second sentence conveys more mood, punchier, and is more active. The second example, we found new evidence, the detective informed her as he slid a photograph across the desk. That's already almost out of breath just saying that. The detective slid a photograph across the desk. We found new evidence. Shorter sentence, you're trimming your word count, you're still getting the point across. Um, that's more concise. Also, eliminating thought tags. Same thing with dialogue tags. You can eliminate thought tags. You just show the character's inner monologue. Now, there are two schools of thought on this. Uh, it's been tradition to show a character's thoughts through italics. However, lately I've been hearing some writers with a different point of view. They don't believe that italics belongs in prose, has no place in a novel or short story, and so you can simply use plain text to convey the character's thoughts. Either way, whichever way you choose, whichever way the publisher uh, dictates you should do in your story, there's no need to add the he thought, she thought dialogue tag, especially if you're writing from first person point of view. You certainly don't need that because everything is coming. from that character's, the whole story is being told from that character's point of view. It's coming out of their head, that one character. So there's definitely no need to add he thought or she thought, and may not even be a need for italics there at all, because it is all from that one character's point of view. Weak language. Um, One item of weak language or one category here is the ly adverb. For example, he yelled loudly, she whispered quietly, they dashed quickly, he tried mightily. Um, Not only are ly adverbs generally unnecessary, I mean, they're, if someone's yelling, it's loud. If they're whispering, it's obviously quiet. If they're dashing across the room, that means they're moving quickly. There's no need to add the ly adverb. And also, they can be awkward, especially when it comes to the rhythm and flow of a sentence. He tried mightily is rather awkward phrasing. There may be other ways to express that um, without using ly adverbs. Um, he yelled loudly. Again, you may not even need that dialogue tag at all. If, as we said in the previous slide, you simply use an action tag instead. You can also avoid or at least limit the use of words like very and really and nearly and quite, sort of, rather. Um, my crutch terms early on in my writing career were began to and started to. He began to turn as he blah blah blah. No, he didn't begin to turn. He turned and looked. Um, if you don't want to even use the word turned, because that may also be considered a weak verb. If something surprises someone, they whirled, they spun, um, that kind of thing. But you don't begin to leap or begin to spin or begin to whirl. You actually do it. You whirl, you spin, you leap out of the way. The only time began to or started to might be valid is if someone is interrupted in the middle of an action. He began to speak, but the backfire of an engine cut him off. That's fairly valid. I would say, if someone's beginning to speak or just starting to speak and something interrupts them, certainly then began to or started to might work there. But generally speaking, we try to avoid that. We also try to avoid weak verbs and verb phrases and try to use stronger, shorter action verbs. For example, instead of someone walking slowly, perhaps they sauntered or strolled or ambled, which conjures up the image in the reader's mind of that character's gait as they move, sauntering or strolling or ambling. Um, Conjures up an image of someone maybe with their hands in their pockets and their shoulders are slumped. They're just kind of casually sauntering along or strolling along. Um, how about instead of walking quickly, perhaps they dashed, hurried, or bounded or darted across the room? Again, it's more concise language, more evocative language, conjures up more imagery in the reader's mind of how the character is moving. Looked angrily could be replaced with glared. Made fun of could be changed to mocked or ridiculed or taunted. More concise. You're worried about that word count. You want to get that story down below the imposed word count. And this is one way of doing that. Is really taking a look at your descriptions and your language and try to remove weaker descriptions, which may use multiple words, and replace them with stronger, more active verbs or descriptions. To quote N.H. Kleinbaum from Dead Poet Society, so avoid using the word very because it's lazy. A man is not very tired, he's exhausted. Don't use very sad, use morose. Language was invented for one reason, boys, to woo women, and in that endeavor, laziness will not do. Well, I can't vouch for the fact that language was invented to woo women, but in this point, I can agree with Kleinbaum in terms of the avoidance of lazy language, uh, trying to use more evocative, pointed language that is precise and tries to conjure up in the reader's mind precisely what you mean and precisely what you want them to see and what the character is experiencing so that the reader can experience it along with them. Always important to read your work aloud. Part of my process when I finish writing a story, go through and do my self editing a few times. I will then, even before I submit it to my critique group, even before I take it somewhere to read aloud to a critique group or even email it to my critique partners for them to review it and add their comments and maybe some feedback and some suggestions. I read the work aloud. I read the work aloud because your tongue will trip over all the things your eyes might gloss over: typos, missing words, added words that don't belong, clumsy or clunky sentences that really lack rhythm and flow and could be expressed more concisely or with better articulation, more eloquently. Um, these are the things that your tongue will trip over, that your eyes may gloss over because you know what you've read, but your critique group and your readers don't know what's in your head. So the best thing to do for me is finish my self editing, put the story away for a couple of days or a week if I have that kind of time. Unless the deadline is creeping up on me, then I'm trying to accelerate my process here. But generally speaking, if I can get the story done with in a reasonable amount of time, and the deadline is still far enough away, I'll put the story away for a while, get it out of my head, come back to it when I'm with fresh eyes, read it out loud, and really see what I wrote and see where the mistakes are and where there's typos and where there's added words and missing words, etc. So I can correct all of that before it goes to my critique group. Because again, in the end, you always want to submit your best work. Of course, all short stories and novels should have conflict, and conflict is the subject of a whole other session, a whole other discussion. But I want to leave you with some quotes from one of the best short story writers in the world and my literary hero, Harlan Ellison, who wrote over 1,700 short stories, articles, essays, novels, etc., screenplays. On the Tomorrow Show on July 4th, 1976, Tomorrow Show was hosted by Tom Snyder. Tom had asked him, "Why is everything always a blank?" And the blank that Snyder was reaching for there was conflict or confrontation. And Harlan responded in this way. He said, "Because that's what life is. It's a confrontation. That is what life is composed of, an endless series of confrontations with the society in which one lives, with one's fellow man and woman, and with oneself. That is what life is all about. And the intensity of the confrontation, the revelations of the human condition that come out of those confrontations, is what makes enlightening drama, is what makes art for us. We must learn from what we read." And finally, I'll leave you with this. Later on in that episode, that interview, Harlan went on to say, "I like to write about those moments when something strange, peculiar, and untoward happens to an average human being who, in that moment, discovers something in him or herself that makes them a different kind of person." What Harlan is talking about here is character arc, how your character changes from beginning to end of your story, whether it's your novel or your short story. Not every short story has a character arc. The character may not change at all from beginning to end. But either way, we're talking about writing compelling short stories. And one of the best ways to start with that is to review some of the tips that we talked about here in this session. Avoiding some of the language pitfalls of excessive description and info dumping, and trying using action tags instead of dialogue tags, and starting with a strong opening line as close to the action as possible. I hope this session was helpful. And if you'd like to contact me or check me out on social media, my email address is philgiunta@ptt.net. My website is philgiunta.com. On Facebook, I'm at writer Phil Giunta, and on Twitter at philgiunta71. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this brief session, and best of luck in your writing endeavors. Thank you.